I'm Nancy Buck. I chair J Street in Boston, and I'm a member of J Street's national board. I want to welcome everybody here. And just to frame this event a little bit, you all know that J Street is an organization that primarily focuses on Middle East policy and the politics surrounding it here. But with the current state of our nation, it's really incumbent on all of us to do everything we can to ensure everyone has access to the ballot this November. So we've already heard from leaders like Stacey Abrams, Attorney General Eric Holder, and Rashad Robinson speak on JStream, and that's there for you to view some other time if you want to catch up. But beyond simply hearing from such leaders, we also want to create opportunities to learn more about voter suppression and to develop the tools needed to take action on local and a national level. That's why we are so excited and honored to have the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights spearheading this training for us today. We have 4 presenters, and I will just ask them to wave so you can see who they are. Lee Chapman is the Director of Voting Rights, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Hannah Freed, Director of All Voting is Local, again, the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights. Jordan Fitzgerald, Voting Rights State Organizing Consultant, and Josh Boxerman, Policy and Research Associate, also with Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. So enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that introduction. Welcome everyone to the And Still I Vote Voter Suppression Advocacy Training. I'm Lee Chapman, Director of the Voting Rights Program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And Still I Vote is a national call to action for people to take back the power of the vote. It's a campaign of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and it's powered in part by our sister campaign, All Voting is Local. We're so excited that you are joining us today to talk about voter suppression and advocacy to protect the right to vote in 2020. You know, today is August 6th, which marks the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And we've made a lot of progress over the last 55 years, but we still have a long way to go until we achieve full equality at the ballot box. To mark the anniversary today, the Leadership Conference and our coalition partners hosted a day of action, calling on the Senate to provide urgent funding to make sure elections are safe and accessible this year. I just wanted to thank J Street for partnering with us on this training. I had the honor of participating in a J Street panel discussion last month with Ari Berman about the current state of voting rights in America. So what is the Leadership Conference? We are a nearly 70-year-old organization that focuses on the communities most impacted, communities of color. Today, we work to eliminate needless and discriminatory barriers to voting before they happen, and to build a democracy that works for us all. With our coalition and partners, we inform the public, decision makers, and the media about barriers to voting and advocate for policies that expand the right to vote, especially in communities of color. But right now, everyone is talking about voting, but it's important to really understand why and how we found ourselves as a country in this moment. Before we get to all of that, we wanted to show you a video that we hope you will find powerful and will help set the tone for our time together today.
Voters in Randolph County, Georgia are outraged.
Malone made a proposal to the Board of Elections to shut down 7 of 9 polling places in the predominantly black areas.
As soon as polling places opened early this morning, the headaches began.
This is so wrong. This is just so wrong.
Now people are literally putting their lives at risk to cast a ballot.
They purged 500,000 voters.
Are you removing black voters from the voter roll just so you can win this election?
We are witnessing a tidal wave of voter suppression efforts around the country.
This is what we call voter suppression. It is not letting me vote for who I want to vote for.
Replace us! You will not replace us! You will
A huge victory in Florida.
Convicted felons across the state now have their voting rights restored.
And I promise you tonight, we're going to make sure that every vote is counted. Every single vote.
Thank you. So in the midst of assaults on the right to vote, it is critical that we fight for greater access to voting. 2020 is the election of our lifetime, and we will not be silenced. In every corner of our country, policymakers have put up discriminatory barriers to the ballot that have shut us out, from closing polling places in Black communities to wrongfully erasing voters from the rolls, including low-income voters, seniors, and college students. They are taking away our right to vote and rigging the system for their own benefit. So we're just going to briefly go over the goals for the training today. A key point we want to get across today is that it's vital that we are lifting up the history of voter suppression for all and remind everyone that this is not new. It is important for people to remember that we have won before and we can win again. To build upon our collective skills and ideas is one goal for today. What we learn and discuss here should go out from here. We all bring our unique experiences and strengths to this work, and that means everyone's perspective has value. Whether you're a first-time voter or someone who has signed up to be a poll worker for over 50 years, your voice is valued and needed. And we want to be sure that we all move to strengthen and grow the community of advocates to connect on this important work and to serve as a resource. So specifically for today, our goals are to understand the history of voter suppression and what voter suppression looks like today, to create a sense of urgency around voting in the time of COVID-19 and heightened racial injustice, to gain an understanding around mechanisms to further make voting rights more difficult for people to participate in, and to fight for voting rights with advocacy tactics to ensure greater access to voting in the time of COVID. So the COVID pandemic and the fight for racial justice have exposed the cracks in the system to many who had not been directly impacted before, and with the voices of those who have lived this reality every day being amplified on our streets, these deepening cracks in vital systems cannot be ignored. At the nation's founding, voting was enshrined only for educated white men who owned property. It took more than a century for the franchise to meaningfully expand to people of color, women, people with disabilities, people who are low income, Native Americans. And today, some elected leaders are still working to silence people who were historically denied access to the ballot box. Voting and the ability to participate in our democracy is a racial justice issue, it's a civil rights issue, and we are overdue for a change. And now I'm going to turn it over to Hannah Freed, who will talk about our state advocacy work. Hannah?
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us and for giving us an opportunity to talk about the work that we do and how all of you can engage in it. My name is Hannah. I'm the campaign director for All Voting is Local. And this is the fourth presidential election cycle that I've worked. And it is one in which we are really facing unprecedented challenges. I have never, speaking personally about this, I've never seen an election year quite like this one. As a voter, as a person who votes, but also as an advocate. And I came to this work because the problems that we are seeing right now that Lee mentioned about long lines and polling places closing in Black and brown neighborhoods, voters asking for ballots that never come, these are not new problems. They're long-standing problems, they're deeply entrenched problems, but they are solvable problems. And that's what our All Voting is Local campaign was founded to do. We do that work in partnership with organizations all across the country. Our team is on the ground in 8 states. Our mission is to expose and to prevent discriminatory barriers to the ballot before they happen, before Election Day. And the fallout from the most recent primaries makes it really, really clear that we have to act right now to ensure that every citizen can freely and fairly vote in the general election, and that the chaos in polling places that we've seen in these primaries has really shown us, has shown the country and shown the world that elections officials have not done enough, state officials have not done enough to date to hold safe and accessible elections during the pandemic. In Milwaukee in April, in their elections, we saw voters standing in line for hours at polling locations after the city reduced what is normally 180 down to just 5. Voters had to find somebody to serve as a witness to validate their ballot, even though there was a stay-at-home order in place because of the pandemic. The GOP brought an 11th hour legal challenge that undid changes like deadline extensions that were just common sense during a pandemic. In Georgia, in their primary in June, we saw voting machines breaking down. We saw poll workers who didn't have enough training and gave voters bad information. We saw voters standing in line for 7 hours in the heat, in the humidity, in rain and in hail with their children when they should have been at work, all because they never got their absentee ballots. This is what voter discrimination looks like now. And voters in these states and across the country have risked their health and the health of their communities to make their voices heard. People should be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote, and they should be able to do that while staying healthy, even in a pandemic. And none of us should have to choose between our public health, the health of our community, and a functioning democracy. Now, there is good news, which is that state officials still have time to get this right. And that is why it is so great for us to be able to have conversations like the one we're having today, because it is because of communities, it is because of individuals and people like all of you who are interested in engaging in this work that we can drive it forward. And our ABLE campaign is calling on officials all across the country to take action right now to respond to this current moment, to rise to the challenge where the pandemic is threatening access to the ballot. And we are seeing some signs of progress. In Pennsylvania, where people, only about 4% of the state had voted previously by mail, the state processed a record 2 million ballot applications for their primary. We've seen key cities in Michigan setting up ballot return drop boxes so that voters can securely return their ballots and feel confident that they're going to count. In Georgia, we helped to kill a bill that would have prohibited sending a ballot application to every registered voter, which is one of the most common sense steps that officials can be taking right now. And Wisconsin's Election Commission recently announced a plan to send a ballot application to every registered voter also. And Milwaukee, where we saw these long lines, unacceptably long lines in the primary, the city is now going to be offering 16 early voting locations, which is up from just 3 in the 2016 presidential election. So that's progress, but the work doesn't stop here. We cannot see another Wisconsin, we cannot see another Georgia in November, and with your help, we won't have to. And I'm now gonna turn it back over to Lee, who's gonna ground us in the history of the struggle for voting rights.
Thank you, Hannah, for that. So yes, I'm just going to briefly go over the history of really, voting rights and how we got here. And the main thing is, voting is power, and we have a long way to go until we reach full participation in the voting process. And it's critical that we understand our history and how voter suppression is tied to systemic racism and white supremacy, starting at the founding of our country when only white male landowners could cast their ballot, which was only 5% of the population. We saw the franchise expand with African-American men with the 15th Amendment. And during Reconstruction, we saw African Americans who were elected to state and federal office. There were 16 African American men who were elected to Congress. But then there was an immediate contraction on the right to vote, with states implementing restrictions like poll taxes, all white primaries, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, felony disenfranchisement laws, and voter intimidation at the polling place, which prohibited Black voters, particularly those in the South, from casting a ballot. You know, in order for Black voters to register to vote, they were faced with impossible restrictions, like counting how many jelly beans were in a jar, or how many bubbles were in a bar of soap, or reciting the entire preamble of the United States Constitution. We saw an expansion when we were given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, and we're actually celebrating the 100th anniversary of that amendment this year. And expansion of the African American vote when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed after years of struggle in the civil rights movement. And today is the 55th anniversary. And lastly, when the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, lowering the voting age to 18. So the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 to ensure that state and local governments do not deny American citizens the equal right to vote based on their race, color, or membership in a minority language group. It banned literacy tests and similar devices, like what I mentioned previously, that were used to disenfranchise voters of color. And this piece of legislation enshrines the right of every citizen an equal opportunity to participate in our democracy. The Voting Rights Act is really the most effective piece of civil rights legislation that has ever passed in our country. Even though we've made progress after the Voting Rights Act, the right to vote remains under threat. And right now we're seeing assaults on all fronts. You know, the courts are rolling back voting rights protections and greenlighting voter purges in states like Ohio and Georgia. With the executive branch, we've seen a lack of voting enforcement by the Department of Justice and a continued false narrative from the White House through the president's daily tweets promoting rigged elections and vote by mail fraud, designed to deter and intimidate people from participating in our elections. And as we know, there is no truth to that. In the legislative branch and state legislatures, we have seen a flood of restrictive voting policies like strict voter ID laws, restrictions on voter registration, and cuts to early voting. And at the federal level, we have seen key voting rights access bills like H.R. 1 for the People Act and H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, blocked by the Senate because of partisanship. So in 2013, there was a pivotal case that really got us to where we are now, and that was Shelby County versus Holder. In 2013, 5 justices of the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was the powerful preclearance provision which required states and election jurisdictions with a history of voting discrimination to obtain approval by the Department of Justice or federal court before implementing new laws and policies. Since 2013, we've seen the floodgates of voter suppression open, and we have seen a wave of restrictive voter ID laws, polling place closures, voter purges, and restrictions on voter registration. And since then, and really even before, over the last decade, we've seen over 200 restrictive voting bills introduced in 40 states. We've seen the largest rollback of voting rights in a century, and we have seen 25 new restrictive voting laws on the books since Shelby County versus Holder. And all of these laws disproportionately impact voters of color. So that's a little summary of the history and how we got to where we are now. But now I'm going to turn it over to Josh Boxerman, who's going to talk about our current national advocacy efforts. Josh?
Thanks so much, Lee. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our major federal priorities in the voting rights space. And so while elections are administered on the state and local level, there is a lot that Congress can do. So this year, as we've talked about already, in addition to all the voter suppression issues that we were already facing, election administrators have also been struggling with the challenges posed by COVID-19. Many of you may have seen the images from Wisconsin and Kentucky and other places around the country with long lines and polls closing. Voters should not have to choose between their health and participating in a democracy. Right now, states need an immediate infusion of funds to have safe and accessible elections this year. In May, the House passed the HEROES Act, which, among many other things, included $3.6 billion for safe and accessible elections, expanded voter registration, same-day voter registration, expanded vote by mail, including prepaid return postage, at least 2 weeks of early voting, including the weekend before Election Day, and safe in-person voting on Election Day. This bill passed the House in May and is currently sitting in Mitch McConnell's legislative graveyard. Negotiations are ongoing as we speak. Many of you may be following the news with bated breath, like many of us are. And our coalition is pushing hard for this funding and these policy mandates to be included in any package deal. Our advocacy has included everything from working with folks in the field like you all, and any conversations that you all are able to have with your elected officials about the importance of this legislation is super helpful. We've also had the opportunity to work with folks like Beyonce's mother, Miss Tina Knowles-Lawson, and the mothers of the movement who have been powerful voices on this issue. And I urge you to check out Lee and Ms. Tina's interview on The Daily Show last week. So that's the HEROES Act. And of course, going off of what Lee just talked about with Shelby County v. Holder, the major long-term priority of our coalition is the passage of the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore the Voting Rights Act and enable it to actually achieve all of the things that it used to be able to achieve before it was gutted by 5 justices on the Supreme Court. So that bill, termed H.R. 4, passed the House last year, but again has languished in Mitch McConnell's legislative graveyard in the Senate. H.R. 4 would reinstate that pre-clearance system that was gutted by the Supreme Court, and it would prevent states from enacting discriminatory voting practices. So with H.R. 4 in place, we could prevent voter registration purges that affect hundreds of thousands, if not millions of voters, all because they may have missed an election or two. We could prevent implementation of photo IDs laws that we know disproportionately prevent voters of color and younger voters from casting ballots. We can prevent jurisdictions from reducing the level of language assistance provided to citizens at the polls. We could prevent gerrymandering that dilutes Black and brown votes. We could prevent the elimination of polling places, particularly in communities of color. And we can prevent any additional requirements and documentation, like citizenship paperwork, that many just don't have access to current registration requirements. So these are the 2 major priorities right now. The most urgent, immediate priority is making sure that we can have free and fair and safe elections this year. And then in the long run, restoring the Voting Rights Act. So I'm going to pass it back to Jordan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan Fitzgerald, and I am an activist and organizer, and I work with states and folks on the ground to really advocate for this, for these changes and making sure that people know what voter suppression looks like and how we can make a difference. So the barriers to the ballot in 2020 have just been further exacerbated by COVID-19. People are really having to make a decision between their health and democracy. And we can't ignore that, and we have to make these changes happen now. There is a long list of barriers to the ballot on the screen, but I'm only going to give a few examples. Voter ID bills, making folks show a voter ID before they're able to cast their vote. Moving, consolidating, or closing polling places without giving people any notice. We found that over 1,600 polling places have closed in former Section 5 states. And proof of citizenship. So these are all some of the things that are making it much harder for people to vote, along with the COVID pandemic. So during COVID, voters will be less likely to register in person. A change impacting the millions of people who register and update their registration in a presidential election year, like this one. States need to identify alternative ways for voters to access registration, including making sure their online voter registration systems are ready for a surge in traffic capacity. We know we just don't have enough poll workers this year, and it's going to be further problematic with people trying to vote in person. So specific barriers to voting during COVID include misinformation about voting and misinformation about the impact that Lee mentioned in terms of the president and the tweets that he makes that are just outright wrong. Intimidation at the polls, and the need for accurate voting information in multiple languages is even more necessary. Plus, we have the protest context that we're dealing with now. Racial injustice has raised its angry head again, and now we're seeing a greater presence of law enforcement and even uniformed military, making it an intimidating climate. So what do we do about this? We need to advocate, we need to educate and communicate, and we need to protect the vote. And so some of the things that you know, and I'm sure that some of these things that you have been doing and you help lead on as members of J Street include the following, but I think it's worth us talking through, making sure that we're all on the same page. So an overview of how to protect the vote in 2020. I mean, there's a number of things that we can do, and voter registration is certainly one of them, but voter education is just as important. We need people to understand that voter suppression is happening and how they can fight back and make sure that their votes are counted. We need outreach to elected officials. They need to hear from us. It's even harder when we're not able to see them in person. So a lot of the activism that I know that I've done in the past is just no longer possible at this moment. And election protection, we really need people to stand up and help make sure that our polls are safe and that people know how to get information. So first, I want everyone to take out your phone or open another window, hopefully not too long, and sign up for And Still I Vote, and go to andstillivote.org. This is our website where you're able to take action on important issues and hear updates as we go. Voter registration is obviously one of the most important things that we can be doing right now, and it will be heavily affected by unfolding events. So we encourage you to consider virtual voter registration campaigns using the 50-state tool available at vote411.org, which was developed by our friends at the League of Women Voters. And it's been updated daily with the election processes and date changes. So making sure people know their voter registration deadline, know does your state allow same-day voter registration, online voter registration, but also educating your friends, family, neighbors, and colleagues about what they can do and making sure they're registered to vote. So connecting with advocacy groups like J Street for assistance with this advocacy is critical. Voter education. Incorporating voter education into every activity that we do, outreach and GOTV activity is really critical. So can you add key dates to neighborhood bulletins? Can you make a quick message in your house of worship bulletin or sermon? Making sure polling place lookup and registration lookup is accessible to people, and engaging movement groups on the ground to incorporate voter education into their advocacy. Strategic communication. So what do we mean by this? Like, how do we talk about the work that's happening and what we need to be doing? Well, one thing that's very, very powerful is story collection. And there are some key things to remember when it comes to story collection, which is first, we're not just talking stories. It's more idea to have a platform for folks to tell their own lived experience. So making sure that they're talking about it on Instagram, on Facebook, on TikTok, we've seen. People need to be telling their stories of why it's important for them to vote, but more importantly, what people can do to make sure that their votes are counted. So you can lift these stories up via a few different ways. Opinion editorials, or something that we call op-eds, letters to the editor, and social media outreach. These are ways that people can tell their stories in a real powerful way that makes it connect with other people's stories and their lived experience. Messaging. Our primary goal is to shine a spotlight and activate our audiences to fight against discriminatory barriers to the ballot in their local communities in a way that resonates. So how do we talk about voter suppression? Well, we need to say barriers to the ballot, discriminatory barriers, needless barriers. Saying voter suppression, I think, is a very lofty way of saying, barriers to the ballot. And so we need to make sure people are framing it in a way that we're not losing the argument. Elected officials. We need to talk to elected officials in your state and your communities to ensure access to the ballot during the pandemic. You need to contact them directly to ask whether they are taking the 10 steps that we're going to put together in our toolkit that we're going to be presenting out to you after this training as a follow-up. And election protection. 186RVote is a really powerful tool that anyone can access and is accessible in many, many languages. So what are 5 things that you can do right now? There are 5 things that you can do that anybody can take action on and I think are pretty accessible. Share reliable and accurate information about voting, and by going to andstillivote.org is one really powerful way that you can share with folks where they can find information that's helpful. Telling elected officials in your state and community to ensure access to the ballot during the pandemic, that we need safe and accessible in-person voting that makes it available to everyone. Tell your voting story. So go to Instill I Vote, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, tell your story and talk about why it's so important to vote, especially in this year. And become an election protection volunteer or poll worker. If you're able to, we need more young people to be at the polls helping out this year more than ever, especially when many of our older poll workers are not going to be available to do this job as we've counted on in years past. So some of the tactics, and I won't go through them all, but here's some of the things that we have done at the Leadership Conference, and I know a lot of our partners do, are patch-through calls. This is a fast and effective way to connect our supporters to lawmakers and decision makers. And it gets volunteers on the phone, and it's something that we can do right now during a pandemic. Textathons, people love to do this right now. It's a way to connect with other members of the community and folks that they have in their address book and get them to take action, ask if they're registered to vote. Twitter storms are another thing that we've done that have been really powerful. And then something that I think has been exciting this year and that people are doing are virtual rallies and virtual house parties. So we can't get together in person, but there are ways that you can do Facebook Live events, just as we're doing today, or holding house parties online. So here's a little bit more on this slide about election information. Now I'm gonna let you know that you don't have to write all this down right now. As I mentioned before, we have a toolkit that goes along with this training. You're going to get the entire slide deck along with the script and all of these tools on how you can actually activate your communities in your own backyard. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lee for us to show one more video before we close out.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And Josh, could you please play the video?
They tried to silence me.
They tried to block me. They tried to deny me.
To scare me.
To scare me.
They tried to erase me.
To erase me.
Erase me.
They tried to keep me down.
Keep me down.
Keep me down.
They tried to make me invisible.
Invisible.
They tried to pretend I don't matter.
Pretend my people don't matter.
But my people don't matter.
They tried to kill me.
Kill me.
Kill me.
They tried to suppress me.
Okay. Suppress me.
They tried to block me. They tried to suppress me. They tried to deny me.
And still.
And still. And still.
And still, I vote.
I vote. Todavía voy a votar.
And still, I vote.
I vote.
And still, I vote.
And still, I vote.
Well, thank you so much for joining this training today, and we hope we've done a good job in outlining why this moment is so important with the intersection of voter suppression, racial injustice, and systemic oppression during a global pandemic. Your work to ensure safe, accessible, and fair elections in 2020 is critical, and we want to support you in this work. Thank you so much for joining, and now we're going to go to Q&A, and I'm turning it over to Jordan to help facilitate the Q&A.
Sure, we've got a couple of questions in the queue. So the first one is, what can be done to pay past costs or charges for ex-felons in Florida so that they will be able to vote in what will be the most important election of our generation?
Sure, I think Hannah would be the best one to answer this because she has a program in Florida.
Hi, thank you for this really thoughtful question. What I'm going to do actually is put into the chat in just a minute the name of an organization that you can connect with that is doing exactly this kind of work. This has been a profoundly difficult and painful issue for impacted communities in Florida. Would not be more wrong to cut off access to the ballot in what is essentially a poll tax. And I know that they will appreciate the engagement and support of advocates. I'm not sure if the question came from someone in Florida or from someone else, somewhere else in the country, but I can put that into the chat in just 1 second so you can work with them directly on this issue.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So we have a couple of questions that deal with counting ballots in November. So what can we do? What are we doing to address the integrity of vote counting process in November?
Sure, I think it's important to note we're going to see the most vote by mail ballots we've seen in any election. I mean, it really is going to be, amazing to see how many that we're going to get this year. And one thing that we all need to get comfortable with is that it's going to take at least a week, if not more, for election officials to count all of those ballots. And that doesn't mean that there's any fraud or anything wrong with the process. That's just how it is. So we just have to make sure that election officials are able to do their job and they can count those ballots. But Hannah, you might want to add more to this answer. I think you're muted. Okay. Next question, Jordan.
We're still getting vote counting questions and the logistics of that, but this one is a little bit more specific about what we can do to help local governments and the Postal Service prepare for this upcoming huge influx of vote by mail that we're going to see this election season.
Yeah, I think, just to go back to what Josh was saying, it's just so important that we push on the Senate to appropriate additional funding for elections this year. That's why we need the additional $3.6 billion. And actually, when it comes to funding the Postal Service, we're asking for $25 billion for USPS to keep and maintain their operations. And as we know, vote by mail is going to be critical this year, as we all mentioned. So it's critical that the USPS is able to operate and deliver those ballots.
Great. Josh, do we have any more questions, or do folks in the audience have any more questions for us? Okay. I think that's all we're seeing right now, Lee. So we might want to reiterate that we are going to follow up. Like I said, we're going to follow up with the toolkit after this, as well as an evaluation. We would love your feedback. You are probably the 5th group that we've done this with nationally, and we really appreciate you partnering with us on this. And we want to continue to refine and improve this training as we move forward. And we've got more scheduled on the calendar right now. So please give us, be tough on us, be nice to us. We will take it all. And we look forward to sending out the toolkit and making sure you have what you need to do the work in your backyard. Noah, can we turn it back over to you? Or Nancy?
I just want to thank everybody. This panel was both informative and really empowering, and we are so excited to partner with you through J Street, and everybody on the call today and everybody else that that responds to the emails will definitely get the kits that you're sending out, and we look forward to moving forward. In fact, this evening in Boston, we are doing a J Street event with Vote Forward on getting out the vote in Texas. So we're already on it, and we just want to thank you so much for this really fantastic presentation, and look forward to working together to really turn things around in November. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
And thank you to all of our J Street participants. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but it is things like this that really keep us motivated and keep us excited and moving forward. So look forward to working with all of you as we do that.